Treaties opened a majority of the Ohio Valley to white settlement by 1809, and pioneers flooded into it. The Old Northwest contained rich farmland, thick forests, and game for food and trade. Hundreds, and then thousands of flatboats floated down the broad Ohio River every year, bringing settlers and goods to southern Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. Most who settled this region came westward from Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and the New England states, although a large number, like the family of Abraham Lincoln, moved northward out of Kentucky. Most were Anglo-Americans and German-Americans. They carried their cultures with them, languages, values, customs, traditions, and ways of making a living which they adapted to the demands of their new environment. Towns appeared with marketplaces, seats of government, and manufacturing centers for iron, glass, leather goods, barrels, and other items too expensive to import. The huge majority of the population, however, lived in the countryside. Most were independent landowners who worked modest-sized farms. Native Americans had long farmed this region, but white pioneers brought a new kind of agriculture. While Native Americans had cultivated several crops on a single plot of land, the new immigrants dedicated one piece of land to a single crop, usually corn, and later wheat and other grains. Pioneers also tried to produce as much as possible, since eventually they hoped both to provide for themselves and to sell their crops in faraway eastern markets. This approach to crop cultivation exhausted the soil much more quickly than Native American farming, and it created a demand for more and more land where settlers could grow crops. The pioneers' use and abuse of their environment pushed the frontier westward. The Old Southwest. Most white pioneers moving into the Old Southwest came from Virginia, North and South Carolina, and Georgia. The rich soil and long growing seasons offered agricultural opportunity, so the vast majority of settlers were farmers. In the Old Southwest, immigrants brought two institutions from the South, which were not found in the North: the plantation system of large land holdings owned by one family, and black slavery. Most immigrants were independent farmers without slaves, just as in the Old Northwest, but the planter elite often dominated political and social life. The two distinctive characteristics of the Old Southwest eventually led to the sectional crisis that culminated in the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865. Southern pioneer farmers, like those to the north, began by producing mostly for themselves, but they also hoped eventually to export their products to outside markets. At first their main export was tobacco. Then in 1793 the New Englander Eli Whitney visited Georgia and devised a machine that revolutionized southern agriculture. The cotton gin removed easily and quickly the seeds embedded in the fibers of short staple cotton, a process that had previously been done very slowly by hand. The cotton gin would allow Southerners to expand cotton production at a time when textile mills in England and the American Northeast were in need of huge amounts of cotton. The southern frontier would soon become the largest cotton-producing region in the world. Especially after the War of 1812, when peaceful commerce was reopened with Britain, the lure of new land for cotton drew settlers rapidly toward the Mississippi River and beyond. As in the Old Northwest, cotton, and especially tobacco farming rapidly exhausted the soil, damaging the environment and encouraging further movement westward in search of new land. The rapid expansion in both the Old Northwest and the Old Southwest strained the interaction between Native Americans and whites, and by 1809, they were moving toward confrontation. The most significant resistance to white settlement came from a remarkable Shawnee warrior and diplomat, Tecumseh, and his brother Tenskwatawa, also called the Prophet. The brothers called for all Native American peoples to join together and refuse to cede any more land to whites. They also urged Native Americans to reject Euro-American trade and culture and to embrace a new religion based on a vision of Tenskwatawa. Although Tecumseh enlisted the support of some groups, a clash between white militia and his followers at their village, Prophetstown, in 1811 precipitated a confrontation before Native American unity could be achieved. The War of 1812 ended significant Native American military resistance to white settlement in both the Old Northwest and the Old Southwest. Tecumseh, who had formed an alliance with Britain against the United States, was killed in 1813 when the British were defeated at the Battle of the Thames. Meanwhile, in 1814 the militia leader Andrew Jackson destroyed a large force of Creeks at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in Alabama. However, the final removal of Native American peoples from these areas was yet to come. In the 1830s the Cherokees, Creeks, Choctaws, Chickasaws, and Seminoles would be taken, most of them by force, into Indian Territory, which was west of the Mississippi River in present-day Oklahoma. By then the occupation of the region from the Appalachians to the Mississippi was virtually complete. Beginning with the Thierrene colonies New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Jersey, New York, Delaware, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, North and South Carolina, and Georgia the country continued to grow. From 1790 to 1803 Vermont, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio became states. Louisiana was admitted in 1812. Between 1816 and 1819, one state a year was admitted to the Union. Indiana, Mississippi, Illinois, and Alabama, and in 1820 Missouri petitioned for statehood. Florida was acquired from Spain in 1821, and Michigan and Wisconsin were organized into territories. The frontier story was not, however, entirely one of conflict. The different peoples of the frontier sometimes mingled peacefully and changed one another. Native Americans adapted horses, firearms, iron pots, blankets, fishhooks, hatchets, and many other European goods to their own purposes. Some wore woolen shirts, drank tea with sugar, and lived in log cabins introduced by Swedes and Finns. Similarly, white pioneers began growing corn, squash, beans, and pumpkins, crops that were introduced to them by Native Americans. They also began using many of the Native American folk medicines. From their hairstyles to their moccasins, the first settlers often resembled Native Americans more than they resembled whites living in the East. The English language also expanded as frontier peoples exchanged vocabularies. Pecan, muskrat, opossum, hickory, and many other words came from Native American languages, prairie and cookie from the Dutch, and cockroach and alligator from the Spanish. Old words took on new meanings. In England corn meant any grain, but on the frontier it came to mean maize, or Native American corn. The many uses of maize were reflected in the more than 150 word combinations that were developed using the word corn. Because the skin of an adult male deer was often traded on the southern frontier for the main Spanish coin in that area, a buck and a dollar came to mean the same thing. The people were as mixed as the languages they spoke. From the Atlantic coastal islands to the Mississippi and beyond, many cultures met and produced generations that blended different races and ethnic groups: English, Dutch, German, French, Spanish, African Americans, and scores of Native American tribes. The resulting ethnic stew was one of the most enduring legacies of westward expansion. As the frontier expanded beyond the Mississippi, many of the same patterns and themes that had been important east of the river moved it. Once again pioneers were drawn westward by economic opportunity and the chance to escape or purify an earlier way of life. Again the United States found itself in bloody conflict with rivals, such as Mexico and Native American tribes. The mix of people and exchange of cultures continued, now with an even richer mix of influences. The United States government played an even greater role in shaping the course of expansion west of the Mississippi. Forces other than the search for farmland also propelled the frontier westward. The far west was a vast storehouse of resources: gold, silver, coal, iron, copper, timber, rich soil, and immense grazing lands. The rise of industry created an almost limitless market for many of the West's riches. That, and an expanding overseas market, gave immigrants additional reasons to move west. Rapid advances in transportation such as the building of the railroads made it easier for immigrants to move west. However, the frontier did not uniformly expand westward from the Mississippi River. By the 1840s, the line of settlement had moved only a few hundred miles past the river. By 1850s, Arkansas, Michigan, Texas, Iowa, and Wisconsin had been admitted as states. Then the frontier jumped across the middle of the country to Oregon and California on the Pacific coast. California became the first state on the Pacific in 1850. The frontier then began moving both westward and eastward, as white settlers gradually pushed into the huge interior area of the Great Plains, the Rocky Mountains, the Great Basin, and the far southwest. Oregon, Minnesota, Kansas, Nevada, Nebraska, and Colorado were admitted to the Union between 1850 and 1876, but parts of the Rocky Mountains and the Great Plains were settled slowly. Then in 1889 and 1890, 6 states were added: North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Washington, Idaho, and Wyoming. This left only Utah, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Arizona in the contiguous United States, all of which had joined the Union by 1912. The order in which states were admitted to the Union reflects the frontiers movement across the American West. The many resources of the West were taken and developed at different times and for different purposes by pioneers from the East. Land in the far west was developed for farming, gold and silver were mined from the mountains, and water was diverted to help make the Great Plains more hospitable for agriculture. Instead of a steady advance of new settlement, the frontier moved as a series of explosive changes. The United States began exploration of the far west much later than some other nations. In 1540 the Spanish conquistador Francisco Vázquez de Coronado led an ambitious expedition in search of gold into New Mexico and the southern plains. Later, during the 1770s, Juan Bautista de Anza and Francisco de Escalante explored the southern Rocky Mountains and much of the southwest, while Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo sailed along the Pacific coast as far as northern California. French explorers and traders explored the Missouri River Valley and the northern plains in the 18th century. The Englishman Alexander Mackenzie, who traveled through western Canada to the Pacific in the 1790s, were the first Euro-American known to have crossed the northern part of the continent by land, while the English navigator George Vancouver explored and mapped the North Pacific coast. Geographic knowledge had economic and strategic value, and for this reason, nations did not share this information. The United States knew little of the Far West at the time of the Louisiana Purchase, when the United States acquired what was roughly the western watershed of the Mississippi River from France in 1803. President Thomas Jefferson, who already had a deep curiosity about the West, selected Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to explore the northern reaches of the new acquisition and then to proceed to the Pacific Ocean. With the help of a Shoshone woman guide, Sacagawea, Lewis and Clark ascended the Missouri River from St. Louis, crossed the Rocky Mountains and descended the Columbia River. After a winter on the Pacific, they retraced their route and returned. Besides being one of the great adventures of American history, the Lewis and Clark expedition, 1804 to 1806, gathered a vast amount of geographic and scientific information, established diplomatic and trade relations with some Native American tribes, and helped establish the claim of the United States to the far northwest. Lewis and Clark led only one of several government-sponsored expeditions. Zebulon M. Pike, 1805 to 1806, and Stephen H. Long, 1820, explored the central Great Plains and the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains. While John C. Fremont covered little new ground during the 1840s, his published accounts, mostly written by his wife Jessie, taught the public about the Great Plains, Rocky Mountains, Sierra Nevada, and California. Maritime expeditions under Robert Gray mapped more of the Pacific coast. In 1792, Gray explored the mouth of the Columbia River, which strengthened the claim of the United States to the northwest. Besides these government agents, thousands of trappers, the mountain men, traveled through the far west after 1820 in search of furs, especially beaver pelts. During the 1820s and 1830s these men's travels did at least as much as government expeditions to fill in what were, to the United States, blank spaces on the western map. One leading trapper, Jedediah Smith, covered more than 16,000 miles in his explorations and provided the government with information and maps of the region. Life on the American frontier, daily life in the new settlements that formed as the United States expanded west to the Pacific Ocean, south to the Gulf of Mexico, and north to Alaska. The westward movement across the continent began during the colonial era in the 1600s and continued into the 1900s. Although each frontier posed its own set of problems, all shared certain characteristics. Settlers on the frontier lived on lands that were sparsely populated. They faced many challenges, including how to produce food, how to protect themselves, and how to create a life in the new land. To meet these demands, they often found it necessary to recast completely the customs and laws they had brought with them. The settlers were thrown into close association with nature and had to learn how to live on nature's terms. Life along the frontiers was built around survival and required that people be in good physical condition. Physical strength and hardiness helped a person survive the rough elements of the frontier, such as the weather and the wildlife. It was also important for people to know how to farm, cut wood, and handle a gun or rifle. The frontier settlers often began their new lives with only the basics needed to survive. When a family first arrived in a new area, they often built a temporary shelter in which to live while they cleared the land. Later the family might build a more permanent cabin. Frontier life called on people to be self-reliant. The settlers had to supply most of their own food, make their belongings last, and improvise and repair their tools. Once a family had cleared the land to farm, built a structure to live in, and established their day-to-day existence, they were ready to improve their situation. They sought neighbors, then schools and stores. Although frontier life demanded self-reliance, settlers often wanted government help. As the settlers' lives improved, they turned to the government to help improve the new region by building roads, recommending crops, running surveys, certifying claims, and dredging creeks. They also wanted the federal government to provide protection for them from Native Americans who were occasionally hostile to settlers moving onto their lands. The most notable type of frontier house was the log cabin. Until the settlers crossed the Mississippi, they were surrounded by dense forests. Frontier houses were built in all sizes and shapes and to all degrees of comfort. Logs for a log cabin were hewn from whatever was available. Oak and pine were the favorite woods. With an earthen floor at first, and often with one side open to the prevailing breeze, it was gradually improved as the settlers found time and interest. They might add split logs for floors, cover the roof with bark, thatch, or shingles, or build a log fireplace and chimney daubed with mud. As the mud filling the holes on the outside of the cabin dried, the settler might smooth and whitewash it. Some cabins had a story and a half, the half-story being used both as an attic and as a sleeping space for older children. Occasionally there were two-room cabins, built generally in pack-saddle fashion, that is, the two rooms were built from 7 to 12 feet apart, with a roof over the empty space. Only rarely were three-room cabins built. In addition to a cabin, the settlers often later built a smokehouse in which to store and cure their meats and other foods, and a corral and perhaps a barn to house the animals. In the grassy areas from the Texas Panhandle to the Dakota Plains, sod houses were constructed from soil matted with grass roots. The sod houses ranged from simple structures built into the side of a hill to two-story buildings. In the arid Southwest, adobe, instead of wood, was a favorite building material. The adobe huts were modeled roughly after the Native American pueblos of the area. Both adobe and sod were used in certain regions because wood was sparse. With little wood available, animal skins were often used for doors and windows. Among the many famous Americans born in log cabins were Presidents William Henry Harrison, Abraham Lincoln, and General Ulysses S. Grant. Food on the frontier consisted of whatever was available. The people on the frontier ate game and fish when they could kill or catch it. The summer season produced bonuses in the form of wild berries and fruits. They also grew corn. If the crop was successful, they would eat well, if with limited variety, through the winter. If the crop failed, they could go hungry and perhaps starve. When a frontier family made a rare trip to town to purchase food, they tended to stock up on flour and jerked beef, thin strips of meat cured over a fire. From then until the supplies ran out, their diet contained many foods made with flour, griddle cakes, bread, and gravy. Except for corn, vegetables were scarce. People on the frontier wore clothes that were functional, long-wearing, and readily available. A woodsman might have worn buckskin, the cowboy boots and a neckerchief, the farmer faded homespun, and the miner brown pantaloons and a felt hat. Women made clothes for their families, buying material by the bolt, so that a mother's gingham bonnet might have the same colored checks as her children's shirts and her husband's drawers. Much of the material was homemade, in which case there was even less variety. The families themselves often made medicine on the frontier. Home treatments were brewed from berries and roots. Sickness was a constant dread to a frontier family, for doctors were non-existent and hospitals unheard of. Cuts were smeared with axle grease, poultices for boils were made from plug tobacco, and broken bones were set with splints of sticks and bandages of leaves and old underwear. Whiskey was often used on the frontier as a way to deaden physical pain. People on the frontier amused themselves primarily by visiting neighbors. A man's visit to a tavern or the family's attendance at a church revival provided events to be recalled in detail through the long cold evenings of the winter. The frontier family yearned for other faces. If people lived close enough, the raising of a log cabin could be a great social event. The women would bake for days, game would be killed and salted down, and, unless the religion of the frontier community forbade it, rum and whiskey would be collected for a work and play party that might last as long as several days. Besides eating and drinking, and perhaps some dancing, the principal pleasure would be derived from conversation. The women might have exchanged bits of information about family rearing, cooking, and fashion. Men might have compared stories about their experiences. Lacking modern toys, the children would seek more or less innocent mischief, from teasing the dogs and riding the ox to walking fallen logs across rushing mountain streams. Civil War. The Civil War divided the United States into two warring sides, North and South. It is sometimes called the War between the States. The war lasted from 1861 to 1865. More than 600,000 soldiers died in the war. The war held the United States together and ended slavery in the nation. A divided nation. In the 1800s, the northern states and southern states were very different. The northern states were industrial. Many European immigrants had settled in the north to work in factories. The southern states focused more on farming. Cotton and other crops were grown on large plantations in many parts of the south. Slaves from Africa tended the fields and picked the cotton. Planters in the south owned nearly 4 million slaves. Northern states had outlawed slavery, and many Northerners believed that slavery should be outlawed in all states. A controversial president. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860, people in the South were angry. They knew Lincoln opposed slavery, and they saw him as a threat to the main source of labor for their plantations. Even before Lincoln took office in March 1861, the state of South Carolina had seceded, broken away, from the United States. 6 other cotton-growing states had soon followed South Carolina. They were Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. Later in 1861, 4 more states joined in seceding: Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee. These 11 states formed the Confederate States of America. The Confederate States, or Confederacy, elected Jefferson Davis as their president. They picked Richmond, Virginia, as their capital. The 22 states that remained in the United States were called the Union, or the North. Lincoln refused to recognize the Confederate States as separate from the rest of the country. As Southern states seceded, they took control of federal forts within their boundaries. Lincoln said he intended to hold on to these forts. Union troops still occupied Fort Sumter in South Carolina. Confederate General